Hello again, my friend, and welcome. I am Chad. You are you. This is a Level Deeper podcast, and this is a place for meaningful conversations, like the one that I had here today with my guest, Bre Wolta, who is a relationship clarity coach and who goes by the Instagram handle of Lucid Living with Bre. And I guess you could consider this podcast maybe my official petition that there are some good guys out there. There's some good guys out there. In this conversation with Bre, we talk a lot about some of her story and experience and how she works with people, and that tends to revolve around this idea of people being in what may be categorized as toxic relationships. And Bre and I talk about what toxic means in her mind and how to help move people from relationships that maybe, this can apply to all relationships. This could be an intimate relationship, this could be a work relationship, this could be a family relationship, but how do we move these relationships that might be toxic in our lives? And if you're listening, I bet you can think of at least one that you might be in some way. How do we move that toxic relationship to a more mature relationship? And in order to do that, what kind of shifts or changes might we need to make about ourselves in order to remove this toxicity from our lives? And what are the benefits of doing that? What are some of the harms to staying in these toxic relationships? Again, this conversation does tend to come from a place of being in a romantic relationship. But as you're hearing us talk about that and you're here in a relationship, I encourage you just to think about and fill in any relationship that you might be in, because I think that the principles that we talk about apply to all relationships. This is one of those fun conversations that's both a balance of some of Bre's story and experience and some more practical tips and advice about navigating some of these relationships in our lives. I enjoyed it. I trust that you will as well. Before we head to the episode, I just want to say thanks again for being here. Thank you for investing your time into meaningful conversations like the ones that we have here. It just means a lot to have you here, and I appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity to have these conversations, to share them with you. It makes me better. I hope that you are better off for them as well. So thank you. Without further ado, here's the conversation with Bre. Okay, so we were talking about depth. We're talking about going deep with people. Have you always recognized that about yourself or known that about yourself?
I think so. In ways in like college and stuff, like I wasn't the party girl, the life of the party, the one that could stir everything up and keep things going. I was very much like, I'm going to have a conversation with this person in the corner, which I think I've always known about myself, that was more of the comfortable place, but hadn't really embraced that as like, yeah, this is just who I am. For a long time, it was like, oh, why can't I be that person? Or why can't I be like the social butterfly that, likes to talk to everybody? And I can do that, but it takes much more energy and it just isn't as fulfilling to me.
Talk me through the process of starting to accept, like, this is who I am, and just kind of embody that, because I can resonate with that a lot. I think probably to this day, I spend a lot of time thinking or wishing, oh, I wish I could be like that person. I wish that I was perceived more a certain way. Growing up for me, it was a lot of, I have a brother who's 2 years older, and he's very outgoing. He's very likable. He was that person where like he would strike up a conversation with anyone. They would immediately like him. They'd be drawn to him. And then I'm kind of in the corner like, I don't know. So
Yeah.
What was the process like for you to start to stop wishing you were different and start accepting and embracing the person that you were?
Oh my gosh. This could be a long story. How much time do we have? I'll give you the abbreviated version. So my past, I had been very drawn to people who I could just become whatever they needed me to be. So I would chameleon into friends. I would chameleon into partners. I didn't really have a sense of self. It was kind of like I was the people pleaser, like to the T, in being able to just make everyone else happy. If everyone's happy, then I'm okay, right? If they're okay, I'm okay. That's like the tagline of codependence and people pleasing. So I was very externally focused on my environment, and out of trauma from my childhood, I needed that hypervigilance. So it wasn't until, I mean, quite honestly, like 5 years ago, I went through an ending to a very toxic relationship. And in that ending, it finally occurred to me that like I don't know who I am. Like I don't know who I am without a person to tell me who to be. And the ending of that relationship was so devastating in so many ways that it was like being burned all the way to the ground and then having the opportunity to rise up as whoever I wanted to be. And so that was the first time that I really did some like deep exploration around what I valued, what I needed, what I wanted, and saw all of those things as like these unique components to my light, like different facets to who I am, instead of, oh, I'm not the quintessential like extroverted life of the party. And that's okay. I'm this way and that is just who I am, and I'm like done trying to force it or done trying to put on a different mask to do the song and dance to get this whoever to like me, right? The romantic person, the platonic person, the colleague, whatever it is. But it took me getting to that real like rock bottom moment to be able to give myself permission, I think, to like embrace it.
Hmm. It's a powerful giving ourselves permission to embrace
Yeah.
it. I feel like
Yeah.
it's often an internal thing that we are not allowing ourselves to show up in the ways that we ultimately want to.
Yeah. Well, it takes a lot of vulnerability to be yourself. And if you have a relationship with vulnerability that's such like if I'm vulnerable, people will leave me, or if I'm my real self, people won't like me and therefore I'll be rejected or abandoned. The stakes are pretty high for you to maintain the status quo. So you have to have a level of self-worth and confidence, in my opinion, to be able to be who you are, regardless if somebody will like that or not. Because if I don't need you to like me in order for me to know that I'm likable, then that gives me a lot more a lot more freedom.
It's such a simple concept and such a difficult one to embrace. I'm just kind of, I'm like
Yes.
nodding my head and I'm like, yeah, of course, that's exactly it. And I'm like,
Yeah.
oh gosh, but then I have to actually go believe in myself. Um,
Right.
okay, tell me about, is there friction? I mean, this idea of I'm going to start really thinking and investing into, who am I? Answering that question. And then you get some
Mhm.
answers, and then you, I'm assuming, start making some decisions to show up in your life slightly differently. What's happening at that phase? Is there friction that you're running into? I mean, what's
Yeah.
what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, you're totally going against the story that you've told yourself for your whole life, right? You're creating a new narrative, and there's always fear in the unpredictability. So in anything that we're doing that's new, it's inherently scary because we aren't familiar with it. So as you start to like stop putting on the masks, because the mask is or has been for your whole life the safe place. If I am just who you need me to be, then we're okay. And you start like tiptoeing in like, oh no, I actually really like this type of music instead of I hate country music. Why am I pretending like I like country music? Right? It's like little tiny steps, and you kind of, for me anyway, it was testing the waters a bit with people of, oh, if I actually show them that I like this thing, are they going to give me the weird like, what do you mean? And that's stupid. And and then also being able to judge like, if you do get that reaction from somebody, are they actually your people? Because people who love you, quote unquote, or are your good friends aren't judgmental in that way. They might give you shit of like, you know, that's interesting, but they won't make you feel like a bad person for liking whatever you like. So yeah, it's scary to try to be vulnerable for the first time or for several times.
Yeah, I mean, what's your message to someone who is maybe at that point and they're like, okay, I have done some of the maybe self work or self realization to know I feel like I want to be this person. and it's different than how I'm currently presenting myself. And it's scary. It is very vulnerable to start presenting yourself what feels in alignment, what feels like truly, authentically you.
Mm-hmm.
What is your advice to that person who's kind of on the brink of maybe stepping into some of that vulnerability for the first time?
Oh my God, this is like my work with my clients. So
Perfect.
it can be a long process, right? To first identify who you are and then build the confidence to be able to express that to the world. But it comes down to you creating safety within yourself. Again, so that you're not putting your okayness on somebody's approval of you. So if you can start by really getting to know those fears, like, okay, if I say that I really like this type of music instead of the other type of music, what is the worst thing that could happen? And you go down your list of fears. Okay, if that thing happens, then what am I afraid is going to happen? And usually we get to some attachment wound that's like, I'm going to be rejected, or people are going to leave me, or people won't stay, right? There's some sort of wounding there. And then we have the opportunity to reparent that part of ourselves so that we can build that strength and trust of, even if this person thinks I'm crazy because I like this thing, I know that I'm still okay. I know that me and my inner children, my inner parts are still okay because I've created that relationship with myself and can reassure them and can sit with their fear and all of the emotions that come up around it. But creating the safety is number one, because if we're seeking safety in other places, then that leaves us in a very tricky situation. Because if that other person doesn't choose to make us feel safe, then we're fucked, right?
Yeah.
To put it bluntly.
Okay, you use the word reparenting. That's an
Mhm.
interesting phrase. Why reparenting ourselves? What does that
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah. Are you familiar with parts work or inner child work?
Let's say base level, but
Okay.
not intimately.
Yeah. So everybody in childhood has some sort of relational wounds. And usually it comes from our primary caregivers. And usually our primary caregivers are our parents, right? Not always. Sometimes we're raised by grandparents or other people. So we have these wounds that are deeply ingrained from the attachment we had with our parents. And so if we can go back into those places, into those traumatic memories as adults, and be able to comfort our younger self in the way that we needed comforting from a parent in that situation, then it helps to heal that wound. So that's why it's called reparenting, because we're giving ourselves what our parents couldn't or didn't or did know better to give us. And it's not always a wound that the parent created. So it could have been like in childhood, you were bullied and you come home and a child wants to come into this safe place and be held and be comforted by their parent, but perhaps their parent was not emotionally available, and so instead of comforting that child, it was very dismissed, like, just stop crying, be fine, you're fine. you know that creates a wound. And so even though the bullying, the parent didn't cause the bullying, the parent wasn't there to comfort the child in that situation. So if we can go in again as our adult self and recognize that, oh, I have this really intimate part of myself that is scared to speak my truth because I just get told to shut up and be okay, then you can comfort that part of you that it's like, oh, it is okay to speak our truth. And we're safe if we do that now because we're not in the same position as we were when we were younger. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so we can actually reparent ourselves.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
how do we do that?
You get really curious about the parts of you that are expressing. So if listeners are listening to this and like, oh, I want to learn more about parts work. So Richard Schwartz is the creator of IFS, which is Internal Family Systems. And he talks a lot about we're comprised of parts of us, parts that have certain beliefs, parts that have certain fears, parts that have certain anxieties. And if when we're experiencing fear, let's say, and we can look at that like, oh, I have a part of me, my fear part is present right now, then we can get curious about that fear part. So that curiosity towards, oh, why do I feel really afraid of this person? Like on paper, right, they're a good person, but when they walk into a room, like my whole body clenches and I don't know what to make of this. Right? So we get curious about that fear part instead of beating ourselves up for having an irrational reaction, quote unquote, to somebody who isn't a threat, quote unquote, right, to everybody else. It allows us to do some exploration around what is happening. And then when we can see that what is happening is very valid based on a past experience that we've had, we can meet ourselves with compassion. Again, that reparenting with compassion, with warmth, with nurturing to ourselves instead of being like, you're crazy. Why are you freaking out? You're an adult. You're fine. Right? We're dismissing ourselves in so many ways, just like totally unconsciously most of the time.
Because that's the opposite of being curious, right? Is just being
Yes.
judgmental towards ourselves and saying, oh, why are you feeling that way? You shouldn't be feeling that way. I wish we could show up, we could be differently. And
Yeah.
that just leads us down a spiral of
Yeah.
not really getting anywhere, right?
Yeah. I'll give you a good example. So the clients that I work with are exiting some sort of toxic relationship. And often the there are conflicting parts in them, right? There's one part that really misses the person, the ex. And there's one part that can see that that dynamic was really toxic and really like not good and potentially that partner cheated on them or what have you. Right? It's the more again, quote unquote rational, like I can see what's happening. So as we're doing our work and they start feeling this longing for this person that hurt them, they can really start beating themselves up of, oh, why am I missing this guy when he did X, Y, or Z? Like I should be able to just hate him and move on. So then we get curious about the part of you that misses him. And what is she trying to say? What does she need from you? Because she just had her whole life ripped out from under her. She had the rug just like, ripped and thrown away. And she's going through some shit right now. So like, com- can we be compassionate about the sadness and the betrayal that she's feeling? And so it helps you to have like an observer lens to yourself so that you can have that compassion.
I really like this idea of parts, like
Mhm.
it doesn't have to be our whole self, our whole identity that feels something.
Yeah.
We don't have to associate everything about ourselves because we feel this thing. It can
Yeah.
be a part of us. It just reminds me of the classic and type situation where I can
Mhm.
feel a part of me can feel this
Yep.
and a part of me can feel something else, maybe the opposite, which I think can
Yep.
make it kind of difficult to navigate these situations. But I like this idea of parts, so it's
Yep.
not encompassing of my entire identity.
Yes. Are you familiar with Glennon Doyle?
Yeah,
Okay. On her podcast, I don't know if she originated this metaphor or not, but it really is a good visual of this. So she talks about parts as like you have all of these parts of you at a conference table. And at the head of the table is like your Oprah part, right? Like your leader, your very your very strong, centered, calm, confident part of you. Your self energy is really what that is. And then all around the table, you have all of your different parts. And sometimes they are yelling. Sometimes they're throwing their papers in the air and jumping over the table to try to like take control of the meeting, right? They all have these different ways that they act out. And what we want to do is hear them, right? Like a good leader gives everybody space to talk. And then she still directs, like she still makes I'm saying she because I'm talking about my self energy, but your self energy as the leader still can make the decisions. Your parts don't get to overthrow the leader, but the leader gets to hear everybody and everybody gets to have a voice and then be tended to in whatever way they need to so that you can come back into that cohesive self. Because when we're moving through our life as the cohesive self, our adult self, we're not being run by all of our past wounding. So we can show up more rationally, more thoughtfully, more maturely in conversations and relationships and all of it.
I really appreciate that metaphor. I
Yeah.
think it's very helpful. I have conversations with a friend and coach of mine. His name's Nate, and for me, like one of the things that gets really loud, one of my people who has a seat at my work, and I have to be there for my
Yep.
clients. And just the example of like, if it's 10 a.m. on a, well, today it's during the workday on a work, and I have to be there for my clients. And just the example of like, if it's 10 a.m. on a, well, today it's during the workday on a Thursday. It's kind of in the middle of the workday, and it's difficult for me to do something that I don't consider my work. Like this is a hobby of mine. This is not something that is the work that I do for clients.
Hmm.
I often get talk about like nervous system and just getting all out of whack, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm not enough. I'm not doing enough for my clients. So anyway, I've had some of that conversation with my coach Nate around. A lot of times I'm just like, oh, I shouldn't be feeling that, and I don't want to feel that. And I wish I could be someone who would be okay with taking an hour and a half to have a conversation with someone and not beating myself up for it. And we had that similar
Yeah.
conversation around, well, maybe you need to try to be curious and listen to like, what is that part of you? What is it wanting? What is it trying to communicate? And also the idea of like, don't forget that you can communicate back to it. So I like this like leader at the table being like,
Yeah.
okay, let's you over there, you seem like you're a little bit distraught. Why don't you share what's going on? And then that part of you can share. And then as the leader, we can say, hey, thanks for sharing. But you know what? In this moment, actually, you're okay. And we're okay.
Yeah.
It's to me. I like this idea of the leader.
Yeah.
It's to me. I like this idea of the leader.
Yeah. And if you're open to sharing that, what is the fear that that part of you has? If you take 90 minutes out, what is this part of you afraid is going to happen?
I'm afraid it has to do around acceptance and being valued. So I'm afraid that if I take this time, I'm not doing enough for my clients. I'm not doing enough for my work. Therefore, these people will not accept me. They will not value me.
Yeah.
Therefore, they will not pay me. And then, I have a lot of internal things around money. And so then I'm
Yeah.
not going to have money. And now I'm in a scarcity type mindset. And then I feel threatened. I feel like a lot of my survival is literally threatened if I don't have money around. So that's kind of
Yeah.
like the way it spirals out for me.
Totally. Yeah, thank you for sharing. And that's a beautiful example of like the deeper fear, right? It's not just about like your clients thinking you're not around. It's about you then not having money and not being able to survive. So when you get curious about that part of you and you're like, okay, part, I hear that you're anxious. I hear that taking some time in the middle of the day is really freaking you out. And let me remind you our financial place. And let me remind you that we are okay. And whatever the original wound was around money, like we're not in that situation anymore. This is actually what our bank account looks like. This is actually how many clients we have right now, right? And like giving them the real life data instead of the version of you that they're stuck in. Because that part of you is in all of us, all of these parts are stuck in an age of the wounding where they really did have to be afraid, or they really did witness people being afraid of or in scarcity. So it's like it's valid, and this is the reality right now, and we're okay. And I promise we're not going to take more than 90 minutes, right? We can set like boundaries for ourselves and so our parts can relax. But oftentimes just hearing them out and recognizing that fear and recognizing that that's an old fear is enough for us to be like, oh yeah, like we're okay. We're okay.
That is an example of reparenting, right?
Yeah.
Is that what we're
Yeah.
talking about?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Whenever we can meet a part of ourselves with compassion and understanding, we're giving ourselves what we didn't get in that moment. So yeah, we're reparenting ourselves all the time. And people use this verbiage all of the time, right? I have a part of me that feels this. I have a part of me that feels that. But Richard Schwartz like put it into a like an actionable model for psychologists to use with clients. And it's such a helpful way for us to work with clients in that understanding of ourselves better than, oh, I'm a fearful person, or oh, I'm just an anxious person. It's like, no, you just have a part that's present a lot of the time.
So I'm curious how you ended up in this role. where you're working
Mhm.
with other people, you're working as a coach, you have programs, you're working with women. You mentioned especially women who might be coming out of what you call toxic relationships, which I want to dive more into later.
Yeah.
What led you to this role? I mean, have you always been this way in the coach, or tell us a little bit of that story?
So, and I laugh because like in my family unit, I kind of was the therapist in for better or worse, in when you're just put in that position when you're younger. So I've always been in a role of wanting to help people. Now I do it in a much more healthy way and have learned how to have boundaries around it and do it based on my own volition. Um, but really, the catalyst for me starting to coach women directly was going through the toxic relationship that I went through. Because I hope we can cuss on here, but I use the word mindfuck
Yeah.
all the time in my copy, in my writing, in my way I talk to women, because the whole scenario of a toxic relationship is a mindfuck. It makes no sense. You're confused. You don't understand how they went from so good to so bad. You don't understand how you lost yourself completely in the process. And then you get to the point where you're finally ready to see the red flags and acknowledge like, oh, this isn't good. I need to get out of this situation. And then often trying to leave exacerbates their behavior, and it makes it really hard if you, especially because your confidence has been whittled down throughout that process. So recognizing that I needed to leave, and then leaving, and then healing from everything that had been chipped away was so hard that when I came to the other side, I was like, I need to help other women do that. Like, this is finally what I know I was put here to do. Before I left the relationship, I had started a coaching program and like tried to figure out what type of coaching I wanted to do. And nothing felt like nothing resonated. I was like, life coach, but what does that mean? Like, I don't know what I would work with people on in their life. Like, I don't know anything about my life. I was still very much in that, like, who am I stage. Um, so it just all came into place as I integrated that whole toxic relationship experience.
Okay, define toxic for us. When
Yeah.
you're saying toxic relationship, what are you meaning when you say that? What does that look
Yeah.
like?
Yeah. So it's on a spectrum, like most things, right? It's never like a black and white situation. But the way that I help people look at this is, in my opinion, toxic relationships are an experience with another person where most of the time you're feeling anxiousness and hopelessness instead of love and safety. So if my baseline with somebody is anxious and hopeless because nothing is working and we're fighting a lot and I have to walk on eggshells, but then we have these really brief moments of love and connection or love and security. That is a more toxic relationship than somebody who has a baseline of love and compassion and respect with moments of feeling confusion or moments of feeling anxiety, right? We have a brief rupture and then we repair, but that's not the baseline. So if you're more on the end of anxiousness, hopelessness, confusion, not feeling loved, not feeling respected, that to me is toxic. And toxic is something that is just harmful, right? It's harmful to your mental health, your physical health, your spiritual health. And oftentimes when people leave relationships like that, we talk about them getting their light back. Like they literally look like a different person because they have just been so drained in every which way from the dynamic that they've been in. And oftentimes these relationships are years long. It's not like I mean, sometimes it's a quick thing, but the clients I'm working with are usually have been in it for an amount of years of going back and leaving and going back and leaving. So it's very draining on the system.
I'm curious about this idea of it being harmful and
Mhm.
harmful to the person themselves in the relationship. I mean, as you reflect back on some of your experience, like how were you being harmed by being in the kind of toxic relationship that you're talking about?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is the amount of stress that you're under. And we know that mental stress is enough to cause physical issues in the body, right? When we are pumping cortisol all of the time because we're not safe in our environment, or we are trying to prevent the next outrage or whatever's going to happen, you're living in a state of hypervigilance. You're living with your nervous system like amped up, turned on. You're in the sympathetic, which is great if you're running away from a threat, but it's not great to live in. So we want to avoid situations where we get stuck on in that level of stress. And then psychologically, in my experience specifically, I was experiencing gaslighting. Are you familiar with gaslighting?
Sort of, but explain it to me as though
Yeah.
I don't.
It's where somebody intentionally denies your reality. So, for instance, if you, let's say you had a big fight the night before and there was no resolve, you both went to bed angry at each other, but then the next morning you wake up and he's making coffee and he like kisses you and he's like, "Hello, sweetheart," like, "Good morning," and you're like, "The fuck?" like, and you're like, "Oh, we're gonna talk about what happened last night," and him saying something like, "Oh, we came to a conclusion that was resolved last night. You don't remember?" Right? So it's like my reality is that it was not resolved, and he's trying to make me believe that it was. So that's a pretty like blatant way of doing that, but it can happen in smaller pieces of even like saying that we talked about something that we didn't, or um, making you feel like your emotions aren't real, or you're being overly emotional, overly dramatic. It's a way of deflecting attention from the problem, which is likely in your eyes them. They're deflecting it back to you. And you start to feel crazy. You're like, did we talk about that thing? Am I being emotional? And then you start to really like chip away at your confidence level because you start to feel like you are losing your mind. And it's a slow process. It's sort of like the frog that's in, boiling water doesn't know it's boiling until it's dead. But that is so psychologically harmful because you start to question yourself, you start to question your intuition, what you know to be true. So trying to heal from that is, in my experience, very challenging because like you don't trust yourself or other people anymore.
How do you go about gaining that sense of self-trust back?
Yeah, it's it's a process for sure. Parts work. Part of it is parts work. Part of it is building that internal safety. Part of it is finding a lot of clarity on what that experience was, because if you can see it for what it was, then you can look back at those issues or those points where you're like, oh, I fucking knew that he was cheating on me, right? And it like validates that my intuition knew something, even though my head got spun around. Like I knew that, and it's piecing back together the little moments that you knew that you were right, or you knew that you really didn't talk about that thing. And if the client in this case is still in the relationship, I'll have them take notes after fights so that they can see like the data. We always try to come back to the data of what actually happened, not what are they telling you happened. So it's both emotional and conceptual, in that understanding the phases of a most likely narcissistic relationship. If they're gaslighting and manipulating you, there's some amount of narcissistic person. So understanding that evolution, those characteristics, is really helpful. Of like, oh, that's what I was in. That's the spell that I was under. Not, oh, I'm a terrible person because I let this happen to me.
Hmm. I'm finding myself curious about, as you're sharing some of your story, some of your own experience. I was listening to one of your podcast episodes where there was almost like an hour-long episode where you were sharing your story, your experience.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about what that process has been like for you around recognizing, sort of owning, honoring your experience, and then being willing to share that with other people. That's a very vulnerable place to be. I mean, tell me about what that was like to maybe kind of come to terms with some of your own experience and become comfortable with that being the foundation of the work that you're doing now.
Yeah. That's a great question. It took a while for me to be able to talk about the experience without the emotional charge around it. So that's a good baseline for people if they're like, I want to be able to share this to help other women. Like, can you share it from a place of you're not still blaming the other person or like trying to make sense of things or trying to throw them under the bus, but you're expressing factually what happened and what your experience was. So I sat with it for a long time and had a ton of fear around, is this person, is my ex going to listen to these things? And what is he going to do if he, you know, comes back around? What's his family going to think? What if they see me on social media? Right. So I had to keep coming back to, what is my intention around sharing? Is my intention from a place of purely helping other people feel not alone? Or is it from a place of wanting to ruin his life? I'm very careful to never use his name. I don't use, details that people would be able to find him. So there are things that I put in place to protect myself too in this instance of sharing the story. And then just coming back to that intention is the potential for me to help women is so much greater now than my fear of what will happen if he or his family members hear what I have to say. Like it just shifted. Like I just don't care. I don't care if he hears. I don't care if his family hears. Like this is my experience, and if he didn't want people to know, then he shouldn't treat women this way. Is at the end of the day, like I want to be of service to other women.
I can appreciate that. I think about intention a lot in the things that I share and these conversations that I have, just returning back to what is the true intention behind some of these things. And I think it's an important exercise to sort of check ourselves from time to time on, well, what is my intention? And not always assuming that just because it's my intention at one point to do good, am I getting caught up in wanting to shame someone else or wanting to put someone else down? I find it's a continual exercise that I need to go through, especially like around this show in particular. What is my intention? Okay, my intention is to connect with someone. My intention is to share space with someone. My intention is to be vulnerable, to show up, and not control what happens afterward as far as some of the numbers. That's one of the things that I check myself in a lot. So I can appreciate this idea of intention, and if it feels like our intentions are aligned with an ultimate good or whatever we define that as, it's something that's been an important process for you to continually realign to.
Yeah, and I like how you said it's a continual like revisiting of the intention, right? Because it might start one way and then you might slip back into, oh, I'm doing this for whatever reason, or the fear might take hold and you're like, oh, I'm doing it to get good ratings or whatever. And being able to check ourselves is also a very emotionally mature skill to do. Like, can I be honest with myself and then make changes accordingly if the answer is not what it used to be?
Okay, so what's on the other side? There's toxic relationships. They don't all have to be that way, right? What's the opposite? If someone finds themselves in one of these situations, we've talked about some of the things, the ways in which it's harmful. We've talked about some of this process of revisiting and figuring out, maybe for the first time, who you are as a person, what you value. So what's on the other side of this?
Finding somebody who aligns. I talk about, in relationships, especially when we've been used to chameleoning into other people, we sort of take what we can get and then we try to force like that we have the same hobbies or same values or same goals. And you can only do that pretending for so long, right? It's like swimming, or it's like paddling upstream against all the rapids and the currents and everything that's coming at you. And it feels hard. It feels hard when we're not aligned with somebody in the way we want to live our life. So when you find somebody who shares your values, who understands your needs and respects your needs and can meet your needs, then you're like in the boat going downstream together and navigating the rapids and the rocks. So it's more easeful, right? Relationships are always are always going to take some amount of intentional work because you're trying to combine your life and your likes and your dislikes and your needs and your wants with someone else's. And there are going to be times that we inherently have miscommunication or disagree on something. But if you can talk about those things openly and there's a baseline level of respect for the other person and their experience, then you can figure it out, right? Then you can make the repair around whatever happens. So if you know who you are, know what you stand for, know what you will and won't, put up with, what your standard is, then when you're dating, you can weed people out much faster, right? It's like, oh, I really value health. I really value doing things outside. I really value eating well. And if you don't, you want to spend most of your time, going fast food and like sitting at home doing nothing, we're not going to have much in common. You're not going to have very many ways to engage together. And that eventually is going to lead to some headbutting, right? So it's not better or worse. Somebody's values aren't better or worse. It's just like, okay, we're not compatible. Now I know. Now I can move on to somebody else. I don't have to pretend to not like being health oriented to fit in with you long enough to hopefully then change you and convince you that you should be health oriented when they have no business trying to change somebody else. Okay? So relationships get to be something that is joyful and fulfilling to us instead of another full-time job.
I do like and appreciate how you said that relationships do involve work. I recorded a conversation with my wife, and the conversation of that podcast was love is supposed to be hard work. It was interesting. I was listening, I think, to your podcast, one of them, and you were saying, love or relationships are not supposed to be hard. And at first I was like, well, I think they are. I use the phrase hard work, but then I was like,
yes.
I think it's the work word that is important.
Yeah.
And I found myself, I'm with you. I don't think that the overall experience of being in a relationship should be hard. It should be difficult. It should be this like constant uphill battle. And there is an element of work, like in any relationship, whether it's an intimate relationship, whether it's just a friendly relationship, a work relationship, they take work. They take real intentional work if we want them to be positive and fulfilling.
Yes.
And it's a lot of work.
Yeah. And hopefully it's two people putting in work, right? For the people who are listening who are like, oh, relationships are so much work. It's probably because you've been efforting about 90% of that, right? You've been trying to communicate for both of you, or you've been trying to go to therapy for both of you, or you've been trying to figure out all the relationship problems by yourself and like present the solution to your partner. Whereas in healthy relationships, both people are equally invested and both people are putting in their own self-work to understand their own shit so that they can come together and be like, this is what's happening for me. This is what's happening when you do this and I get triggered and this is what I need, right? It allows us to communicate in a much more healthy way versus the relationship where there's not space to talk about things. There's not a problem-solving attitude. There's not equal distribution of the solving of the problem. Those relationships feel hard. Have you had that experience in relationships where it's like this feels like we're going upstream?
No, but I'm not a great example because I've only been in one relationship in my life.
Oh,
so
great.
That's my current one. Yeah,
okay.
I met who is now my wife 11 years ago, and we dated and we got married, and that's the only relationship that I've ever been in. So I'm gosh. Thank you for being willing to do the work with me. So I guess. Yeah, I don't have the experience of, feeling like I'm blessed to have someone that believes in putting in the work individually and as a couple. And we, at the end of every couples therapy session, we often look at each other and just say, thank you for being willing to do the work with me. So I guess, I don't have the experience of, feeling like you're battling uphill. So my experience is more around a mutual desire to do work. So I guess I can at least attest to that does feel very important. It is work, and it is possible to have someone, to find someone, to be with someone who is willing to invest in doing the work, both as an
Yeah.
individual and together as a couple. So that's more
Mhm.
of the end of the spectrum that my experience has been on.
I'm so happy that that is your experience. That is so amazing. And for your listeners, whether they're male or female, I think it's really important to name that that desire to do the work is not gendered. Because I work with a lot of women who are like, oh, men don't want to put in the work. Men don't want to engage. And I have to do all the work. And I'm like, nope, you've just been with the wrong type of men. Because there are men who do want to engage and who do put in the work and who do advocate for therapy or coaching or whatever you're doing. So thank you for being one of those men and that example of, yeah, I believe that this is equally, a responsibility of both of us.
Which, yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm not like super outspoken about it, but at times I do feel like I try to be just kind of like hey, just so you're all aware, like there are men out here that,
Yes.
I do personal therapy and we do couples therapy. And I was
Yeah. Which is a very important thing for us to see, right? Especially women who have only had one experience of a certain type of man. They don't know what's possible. They don't know that that's real. So to be that expander for somebody is such a cool honor, whether you know you are being that or not. Like I can imagine a woman listening to this and being like, "Oh, I didn't know that about Chad, and now I know that about Chad," and like, cool, like that makes me look at him differently, or that makes me
being sort of an
value him and his
example of,
podcast
I just had a
differently
recent
because
episode with
he's
a guest. His name's
one of those men.
Angelo
Like it's such
Santiago, and we started the episode
a
off
cool
with
thing
like,
to be
hey, we're probably going to
outward
talk about
about.
how well, and it's one of the things that has been a mission behind this show is connecting with other men and being sort of an example of, I just had a recent episode with a guest. His name's Angelo Santiago, and we started the episode off with like, hey, we're probably going to talk about how men can show up differently in their lives, how they can, maybe embrace some of the work that they might need to do as individuals. Let's just start by demonstrating that. And let's just start by demonstrating two men, and let's just share something that we're struggling with at the moment, and let's talk about that. What's going on in
Yeah.
your life that you're having a really hard time with? And so I guess that is part of why this show feels important to me, is that I hope we can set some example, and I can continue to work on the way that I connect with other men, with other women, with everyone. But just setting an example of this is what it's like to go deep. This is what it's like to explore ourselves. This is what it's like to be curious, in hopes that through setting some of that example by having conversations like the one that you and I are having today, maybe we can inspire someone to do something a little bit differently in their own life. And then those small shifts, they add up and they really make a difference.
Yeah. Yeah. When you can give someone hope that a thing exists that they didn't previously know existed or didn't believe existed, that can open up a whole world, right? They could go from being fed up with dating to being like, oh, maybe I'm just looking for the wrong type of person, or I have this very shallow, finder on. And I can actually name what I want and know that there's somebody out there who will also like therapy. So you never know. Like you never know how you can impact somebody by just being your authentic, true self. To go all the way back to our vulnerability conversation, like that is very vulnerable of you to say, I go to couples therapy. I do this willingly because I believe in being a good partner for my partner. Like that's amazing. And from male standards, right? That's a big shift of what we've been raised in a lot of ways to believe that men are, that you can be vulnerable and you're safe being vulnerable. It's very cool.
Which I'm not okay with that being the standard for men. I'm like, we gotta change this standard. We gotta be out here doing something differently, and having a different standard for what it means to be a man, and how men can show up in relationships, how men can show up for themselves. Yeah, I don't want that to be the standard. So I
Yeah.
appreciate you joining me in the quest to raise the standard. Um,
Yeah.
I Before we wrap up, I wear many different hats. I have many different curiosities. One of the hats that I wear is also an entrepreneur. I happen to be in the marketing space, and so then it always makes me curious about other entrepreneurs. And in
Yeah.
particular, I'm curious about, you use verbiage like mindfuck in a lot of your materials and in your marketing. I'm curious about how you came to some of the decision to present yourself that way. Does it feel natural? Is it difficult to do that? What's that been like?
So I'm like kind of this weird combination of person where, not weird, it's a unique combination of person where I can make people feel really safe and seen and held and nurtured. And then I also cuss a lot. And so it like is a natural thing for me to incorporate into conversation with friends, people, whatever. And so I did struggle. I was like, oh, is this going to be off-putting to people to just have the word fuck on my like main page? And then I'm like, if I were to look at somebody and they were speaking in the way that they speak, that is drawing to me when I see women doing that in their copy or in the way that they present themselves. And it almost lowers the like, I'm the professional and you're the lower than. It's like, we're just in this shit together. And I'm a little bit, I'm 7 steps ahead of you and I can help you move this in this direction. But like, I'm not better than you. I'm not some guru. I'm not some like perfectionistic professional person. I just want to like relate to you and help you in the ways that I can. So to me, it helps me stay true to that piece of me that would feel like I was being somebody I wasn't if I didn't incorporate it.
I think it's part of the equation of showing up authentically.
Yeah.
It's a conversation I have often with my clients around, they'll ask, should I swear in some of my material? Should I talk about religion? Should I talk about politics? And we'll often have the conversation of like, well, is that a core part of who you are as a person? Is that a core part
Yeah.
of your identity? And if so, why would you separate that from the work that you're doing?
Mm-hmm.
And embracing and accepting that, yes, if you present yourself this way, it might turn some people off to you. They might say, oh, I could never work with Bre because she uses the word fuck in her marketing materials.
Yeah.
And that is perfectly okay. That person probably wasn't meant to work with you in the first place. So it's a conversation I have with people a lot. And so I'm always just curious about how people outwardly present themselves. Is that kind of the
Mm-hmm.
experience that you've had, though? Is that when you present yourself in a certain way, you present yourself authentically, are you more likely to attract the type of person that you're going to probably connect with better anyway?
Yeah, totally. Like, and that's a better experience for me and the person. Because if, let's say I took that off of my website and I attracted somebody who was very anti cussing, but then we're in session and I drop the F bomb a few times or something and they're like totally turned off, that's going to be a much harder situation than somebody seeing that on a website and being like, oh, okay, she's not for me. So it's little things that if people are attracted to that type of characteristic and a personality, then we're going to mesh better together anyway. And that's better for us both. And that's more sustainable. So to go back to like putting on the masks of things that you aren't, you can do that for a period of time, but is that fulfilling for you? And is that a sustainable thing to have to do day in and day out in every client session that you're in? For me, no. And it's not worth it to me to try to pretend to be somebody I'm not just to potentially get more clients.
For a long time, I was sort of ashamed or quiet about the fact that I lived in a van. And that felt
Yeah.
like, because I came from a very corporate background, that felt like it was something that was going to be just kind of weird. It's a very different lifestyle. I'm often not showing up in button ups or ties. I'm just wearing t-shirts. Like I have a little, my closet is just one drawer. Like I don't have a very robust wardrobe in the van. And for a while, it felt like I needed to kind of hide that. So, I tried to make my background like as sort of normal looking as possible so that maybe you couldn't really tell that I was in a van. And it wasn't until, I don't know, the last maybe 6 months to a year where I've really embraced that, like, this is who I am. This is a part of my lifestyle. Like, I have intentionally chosen to travel full time and live in a van because it's important to me and it aligns with who I am as a person and how I want to present myself. And it's just been interesting since I've been more kind of outspoken about it, that's been my experience as well. Like recently, I started working with a client, so it didn't stop people from coming to me. And I think, we connected. A lot of his brand is around this idea of break the mold. And what am I doing in my life? I'm breaking the mold of a traditional man or a traditional, what people are usually doing. And so I've just found that to be my experience as well, that when we own the parts of us, we own the parts of us and the ways in which we want to show up and who we authentically are, it will attract the right people to our lives. And when we do that, it feels really damn good.
Yes. Yes. Whether it's business, whether it's dating, whether it's friendships, right? I understand the tendency and the drive to put on what we think people want to see because we want that connection. But if you have that internal safety, you have that confidence of like, I'm going to trust that when I'm myself, I'm going to attract the more fulfilling people. That is a place of empowerment, like hugely powerful, because you don't have to pretend to be everything for everyone, right? There's so many coaches, there's so many potential people to date, there's so many people that you can be friends with. It's like, if I'm not the right fit, okay. Nice to meet you. How can I help you find the next? But we don't have to try to fit in with everybody's needs.
I love that you brought it back to kind of full circle, and that we can apply a lot of the things. I talk about that often in these episodes. Is like, we talked a lot today in kind of a relationship oriented lens. And this way of thinking and acting can apply to any relationship. It can be a romantic relationship, it can be a work relationship, it can be a relationship with ourselves. So I appreciate, I think it's a good place for us to kind of land the conversation as we bring it back to all of these things that we're talking about can be applied to really any area in our lives. And if we show up authentically, if we have an idea of who we are, what we value, we embrace that, we show up that way, we're just more likely to attract similar types of people and things in our lives. And I think if we can all do that, we're all going to feel probably pretty good about things.
And you're going to be happier. Like, the attracting cool people is sort of the secondary benefit to just feeling excited about your life. Because when we're living in alignment with our values and who we actually are, that's like feeding us. We're getting recharged by the things that we're doing. We're not getting drained by the things that we're doing. And so life just becomes more enjoyable. And we like waking up every day to do our job or to be with our partner or to have our friendships. Like, it just feels better. And so you creating that ability for yourself and giving yourself permission to feel good in your life is huge.
Thank you for being a person of depth. Thank you for valuing these conversations like I do. Thank you for being here and joining me on the show. I value when people, and appreciate when people are willing to join me in this space. These conversations are ones that they light me up and energize me. So thank you for being willing to do so. If people wanted to learn more about you, more about some of the coaching work that you're doing, what are the best ways for them to potentially learn more and connect with you?
Yeah, on social media, I am Lucid Living with Bre. And my website is brewolta.com. So you can find all the information and ways to contact me through those two places. And thank you for creating a space to be able to go deeper. And anytime you want to do it again, you just let me know.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And I look forward to just, everyone. I mean, she's posting a lot of awesome stuff on her Instagram. So go check out some of the things that she is talking about. And if you resonate with some of these things, she's got some awesome programs. So I look forward to continuing to follow your success, and we'll be cheering you on.
Yeah. Thanks, Chad.
My friend, thank you again for tuning into today's conversation with Bre. Let me know what you thought of it. Was there something about it that stood out to you? Was there something that you want to digest or think about a little bit more? I would love to have that conversation with you and talk about what we can take from this episode. So if you want to connect with me, you can do so on Instagram at A Level Deeper is our Instagram handle, or directly through email, aleveldeeperpod@gmail.com. You can email me directly, and I would love to hear from you. Anyway, send me some of your thoughts. Otherwise, the best thing that you can do to help support this show would be to share the episode with someone who you think might benefit from hearing this. Is there someone who might need to learn how to navigate some of the relationships in their life better? And if so, maybe this could be a tool that could help them. And maybe you'd be willing to send it to them and see if it might be something that could be useful. Thanks again for being here. I'll look forward to sharing another episode with you next week on Tuesday, and I'll see you then.